No, thanks. When I was putting this talk together, I realised I really want to put this in a very broad historical perspective. And a bit like Ken, I shamelessly am conflicted in many areas, and all sorts of areas I'll probably talk about myself and my family. But I think if you're going to put a story in context, it makes it stops people going to sleep, for one, particularly after lunch. So let's go. Now, we've got to go back to 1887. Now, it's interesting, the first bone marrow transplant here was done, in fact, on the centenary of the laying of the foundation stone of this hospital, which was not here, it was up in Willoughby Road, probably fairly close to where Luke Coyle now lives. And this was a cottage hospital. The hospital grew out of the community. There was no harbour bridge, and you can imagine what it was like in those days. And we then go to 1902. Now, 1902, of course, was when the main hospital was built here. The foundation stone was laid in 1902, and that's the building. That's probably the only bit of the hospital that still stands around here from those early days, and it's called the Vanderfield Building, after Roger Vanderfield. Now, we need to go back a little bit before that, although I'm mainly going to sort of go from 1902 to 2017. But if we do a bit of a time warp, we in fact go back to this motor vehicle and my great-grandfather. Now, my great-grandfather was the first Australian graduate to be appointed to Royal North Shore Hospital. He was a surgeon and a gynaecologist and a GP, and he had the first car in North Sydney, believe it or not. And I've got a picture of it. I don't still have the original car, but it's a French Bouton de Dion, and you can imagine him driving from Miller Street, because it's all expressway now. He would have had to drive up to Willoughby Road, and then when they built the hospital up here on the current campus. And I sometimes think, when I come into the hospital now and you're trying to park your car, I just wish I still had that car and could go on this little circle and make people think there's a little bit of history here. So we now go to 1980, and the reason I made 1980, that's the year that I came to North Shore Hospital, and I want to bring a link we've been already talking about, is a close link between St Vincent's Hospital and North Shore Hospital. Now, believe it or not, I've kept all my ID cards from, I don't know why. I pulled my drawer out the other day and these things are all sitting there. And you can actually see me ageing bit by bit as you go along. But you'll see the name of the place has changed progressively. However, I'm now emeritus. But when you look up at emeritus, it's served out one's time, done sufficient service and discharged with honour, but retained on the rolls, and I qualify for free parking. Which... But so when they give you the free parking thing, this is what you get. And look at it. They couldn't spell my name. I don't know who McGowan is. It's not part of my name. And I'm now a volunteer. So you've got that. So I still feel the old farts wanted around here. So that's when I came to North Shore. Now when I came here, I was very closely linked with St Vincent's, having done all my postgraduate training there, University of New South Wales. And it was very interesting. We have retained that link the whole time, and you're going to hear a bit more about that today. Jim Biggs, we have to say a lot for. Jim Biggs was the guy who really inspired me in haematology, the same way as Chris has been sort of saying I perhaps did it. But but Jim was one of these guys who his brain was just so big, all these crazy ideas, and you know, you had to keep him under control. But at the end of the day, he was a great guy to work for, and he had lots of good ideas. Now, I do have to fess up here. There is another connection here which we have to be careful of, and that is Mary McKillop. You probably know who's buried in North Sydney. Well, in fact, my great-grandfather was her GP, and we have various letters between the two. And I used to get occasional patients who knew about this and thought that I could perform miracles for advanced relapse disease. I had to make it fairly clear that wasn't the case. So don't get the idea we started transplants to try and perform some miracles. Now, when I came in 1980, these were the key people. The three on the left were the ones I was told controlled the place. And I said, well, they're the ones you've got to watch out for. So anyway, there's a story with each of them. Keith Jones, of course, was head of department at the time. But I mentioned Doug Piper, dear Doug Piper. When I came over, I'd only been here for 6 weeks at North Shore, and Doug Piper said to me, he'd have this way of fronting in and he'd say something, he'd get you on the back foot straight away, you know, on the defensive. And Doug came in one day and said, what are you doing about haematology teaching at North Shore Hospital? And I said, gee, look, I've only been here for 6 weeks, Doug. What are you talking about? B-trol, folate 9, what else is there? And this was one of the issues. Haematology had not developed at North Shore. And I can tell you another story there, that the actual Department of Medicine, and my father was a physician here at the time, each specialty clinic developed at North Shore, but when it got to haematology, the physicians said, oh no, we're all haematologists. So they voted down developing haematology as a specialty. And that's in some ways what held things back at North Shore. But my father was very upset about this because he could see haematology being a specialty. And this was before I was getting into haematology. And so he, in fact, got one of the lab haematologists who also had his College of Physicians exam, which was Barry Way, and he asked Barry would he do a haematology consultant service in room 7 in the diabetic clinic on Wednesday afternoons. So haematology started at North Shore in room 7 at the diabetic clinic on Wednesday afternoons. So if anyone wanted a haematology opinion, that's the way they got it. So that's sort of a bit of a background. So when I first came to North Shore, I was determined to not... There's a lot to do before you start considering transplantation. There's a long way to go. Roger Skerr, I'll be mentioning in a moment, was a key person in a lot of this at the time. And of course Chris Arthur was too. I mean, Chris was one of my first registrars, and Chris in fact decided to do haematology before he'd actually done his College of Physicians exam, but we knew he'd pass it. So Chris actually joined the lab and then also passed his College of Physicians exam, which you couldn't do these days, but then again, Chris and I have always broken rules in our various careers. So that's the people involved. Now, we should also point out that these 4 people here have an article in the Medical Journal of Australia in 1960 where they did in fact do the first transplant in Australia. And it's described, I mean, it was a bit of a Mickey Mouse job. I mean, it's not what we do now, but the concepts were all there. In fact, a lot of what we're hearing about from Ken is in fact in that article. So there was an attempt to treat a patient with melanoma and do a transplant back in 1960. Now I'm also old enough to have given some of the first MOP therapy in Australia when combination chemotherapy came in. As a young intern at Prince Henry Hospital and then at St Vincent's Hospital, this idea of we got all these drugs that work in cancer, but you'd give one, patient relapse, give the next one, patient relapse, and then these guys said, why don't we just give all the drugs at once? We thought, oh hell, that's going to knock the marrow out and cause all sorts of problems. So in fact, this is when combination chemotherapy came in, and MOP, of course, is no longer used, but it was a gold standard for Hodgkin's disease for so many years. And on the left there, you can see I've got, oops, I'll just go back. You can see there, we've got 1 year survival of various diseases that we've been talking about. Now that's a 1 year survival. So there were improvements happening in relation to 1 year survival, but they were all relapsing very quickly. If you then look when MOP came in, the other diseases were still not doing any better, but Hodgkin's had taken off. So that was a sign that really if we change our chemotherapy and give differently, the world might be a better place. Now the next interesting thing was, at this time I was on the Board of Education of the College of Pathologists, and I organised the first basic pathological sciences course, because I really believe you've got to have this very sound basis to everything you're doing. So we organised this course at North Shore, which was very successful. But I just show you, it was in 1985. This is not long before we did the first transplant. But what you'll notice here is the first person I got to speak was to talk about cell death, Professor John Kerr, who's really a very famous Australian, perhaps should have even been on the Nobel Prize list because there was a Nobel Prize for cell death and apoptosis years later. When I put that on the program, I got enormous criticism from everyone saying, why would you want to put cell death on a basic pathology program? But we could see at the time that this different way of, not different, but this alternative way of cells dying was going to be critical to understanding diseases. I won't go through this in detail, but you can see all the other things that have been happening over the last century and into this century, where we've had all these major advances, and all these major advances have all been highly significant in terms of the sorts of therapies we can give now. We couldn't do any of the therapies now that back in the past, if we didn't have these other things going on as well. I put up two people here you've probably never heard of, Judson and Latham. There's a Latham Bowl, which is a haemonetics one, but this was the beginning. These are two biomedical engineers who really started apheresis. And you know, I was young enough, and they were old enough and still alive for me to meet them. And you'd see these guys talk about how they developed this sort of technology. And you know, the technology we have is amazing. The science is amazing. Too many people mix up technology and science. And it's very important that patients understand the science of what we're doing, and then we have technology, in fact, to help carry it out. And if you really want to look into the technology, speak to the guys who design these machines. They're really quite amazing guys. And then we have the continuous flow centrifuge, which is one of the early continuous flow, and the haemonetics on the left. But it was a lot of hard work in those days, particularly with the centrifuge, because it was not disposable, and it was a real business doing a turnaround to for collecting cells. And in most of what we're treating there was treating hyperviscosity and various haematological disorders and plasma exchange. So the apheresis here is another interesting one. I won't go through it in detail, but this was one of my main areas of contribution and research, particularly during the late 70s and the 80s. And it's now a very established part of therapy in so many areas of medicine. But again, very important, particularly as we move from bone marrow collection to peripheral blood stem cell collection. But this was, in fact, the first successful transplant at St Vincent's Hospital, Jim Biggs. And what was particularly interesting in this one was we had the plasma exchange. It was an ABO blood group change. So you can imagine doing the first one where we had not only to deal with the transplant, but we all had a major blood group change. And it was very, very exciting when you saw these reticulocytes arrive because they were the right group from the donor. We didn't have any trouble knowing where those particular reticulocytes came from. The other interesting thing with this case was that we had to transplant hereditary serocytosis into him because that's what his donor had. But luckily that was a fairly mild form of hereditary serocytosis. And David Marr, I'm sure, remember the second transplant we did, we put Thaltray in, didn't we, David? I think that was what it was. So the donor doesn't always have what you want. So we're sort of, you're at these exciting cutting edges, and it was always Jim, that's Jim Biggs on the right there, by the way. Jim Biggs was always the one telling other people to do it, but he sort of had the idea. So we survived all of this, and it turned out successful. You saw Donald Thomas earlier on. I was fortunate to meet him not long before he died, actually. But I put the slide up on the right there. You can see the cumulative number of bone marrow transplants being done, coming up to about the time we were doing the first one at North Shore. So you can see it was clearly going to become part of therapy for patients with haematological malignancy. Now here we've got the three amigos, and on the right we're not quite sure whether he was the cook, the bodyguard, the psychotherapist, but Roger was always there. Roger would work with us at Vincent's. Roger came over, and if ever you didn't know what to do, you spoke to Rog. Now, it wasn't that Rog would give you the answer. Roger just make you feel good. And you're probably going to make the right decision. But the reason I talk about the three amigos, you've probably noticed we all went to the University of New South Wales. And I was in the foundation year at the University of New South Wales, where Sydney University said there's no way in the world that the university can produce doctors. And there are lots of cartoons in the papers at the time. What a big joke it was to think they could produce it. Well, anyway, we decided that we would invade and come over, and so the three amigos ended up over at there. But I've always been suspicious that Roger School was a double agent. So if anyone has any information about it, just please let me know. Now, interestingly, there were some very key people at the University of New South Wales. Frank Rundle was a senior surgeon here who started thyroid surgery at North Shore Hospital. So he's a key person. Then on the right, you've got Bob Walsh. He started the blood bank in Sydney, and then he became the first professor of human genetics at the University of New South Wales and subsequently the dean. Bob Pitney was an associate professor at New South Wales, then came back as professor of medicine at St George. He, in fact, was on the paper that described haemophilia B, and he was one of my main mentors and the mentor for many other people. And I'll come back to Bob in a moment. So, and he ultimately became the dean. So there are two haematologists here became the dean of the Faculty of Medicine out at the University of New South Wales. Now, the transplant. Now, no aspect of, you've really got to look, whatever you're doing in medicine, you can do simple things, but you don't need a lot of, you take off a little skin cancer or something, it doesn't mean you just take it all and forget about it. But boy, when you're going to do big things in medicine, you've really got to have the big picture. And you never go ahead and do anything unless you know you've got everything in place, all the people you need, the science is understood, the patient understands it, and the technology is understood. So you've got to get the right context for all of this. And we've got the patient in the middle here, and I apply this particularly to bone marrow transplant, but it applies to a lot of the things we do in medicine, particularly as medicine gets more complex with invasive therapies. So what we've got here are all the aspects that you have to make sure are properly in place, and I've tried to size them a bit in relation to the actual importance of them in relation to the patient surviving. You'll notice the nursing's one of the biggest. You've got to have that bit right. They're there 24 hours a day. So it's absolutely critical you've got the nurse, and then you've got all the other bits I'm sure you particularly understand. Now you might say, what have I left out? Well, I left out bureaucracy. Now, I learned from Jim Biggs that it's much better to tell them what you've done rather than ask them what you want to do. And call it the done-it principle, call it what you like. But no, admin were on side, but the more and more you try and discuss what you're going to do with administration, the more and more they get nervous. And they want a risk management profile before a benefit management profile. So the idea is sort of get into it and keep them informed, but with sort of one-line letters or quick phone call. Then it's all, when it's all successful, they're the first ones wanting to get onto you. Oh, we've got to get the media, health report. We've got to get all this up there, you see, because you've got to give bureaucrats ego support. And the way you give them ego support, because we get it from patients. We get ego support from patients and the successes and from the people we work with. Bureaucrats are being hit all the time. They've got a tough life. So you've got to make them feel good on occasion. And if you've got a great idea, just make sure that it eventually they present it back to you as their idea. And then you say, gee, that's a good idea, that is. So there are ways of working the system. Then we've got psychology, social net, the social side, and the family. And of course, the bone marrow transplantation, the family side and all this is absolutely critical. Everyone's got to know what you're doing. The family's got to know. And I frequently use, whenever I'm giving tutorials and things on informed consent, and because we're lucky, we look after patients for a long time, get to know them very well. To me, the essence of informed consent, I frequently say, was when you have a worst outcome for the patient or the patient dies, that they come to you and they say, doctor, you did mention this was a possibility. And I think it's very important that when you're looking after patients for a long time, they're all together on the same page, but you've got to have all the nursing staff on the same page. Everyone's got the lab staff. They all need to know what's going on. It's not a hierarchical structure. Everyone's in a flat structure where everyone's got to know what's going on. Transfusion, of course, is a very big component of it. It's a component that I've been particularly involved in and is my main area of interest these days from a research and teaching perspective. I would point out, though, this is the original blood bank in York Street that I remember as a kid. You come over the bridge, this building got knocked down. It's a very famous building. It would never get knocked down today. And that's a slightly more up that before they knocked it down, of course. And then anyone going to the airport, but look, you don't drive to the airport these days, you get the train, so you're not going to see it. But if you drive, that is the blood processing centre near the airport, and it's a most remarkable building. And you've got to remember there are all these people working there to help us behind the scenes. A very important part with all the blood donors. So we're going to go ahead and do the first transplant. And I think I'd have to say that it was a challenge because we all knew that we were ready to go. We had all the people in place. And I compared it with St Vincent's where I think, hell, we've got everything in place here. We've never done this before. We're in a position at North Shore that we did in fact have all the right people and nursing staff, but there was resistance. Because the first time you do anything, you're going to get resistance. People saying, oh, you should send him to Vincent's, you should send him to Vincent's. And, it was a bit of psychology managing that, but fortunately everyone finally agreed, all on the same page, and we could in fact go ahead. Now, just to conclude, I just put in example here. This is how things can connect up again. I bring Bob Pitney in again. When Bob Pitney was looking after Cecilia Chan with acute myeloid leukemia out at St George Hospital, diagnosed in 1982. And then she relapsed twice while Bob was looking after her. And then sadly Bob died, and she then got referred over to me at North Shore in relapse again, and we went ahead and she had an autologous transplant which was very successful. So after 3 relapses, she was one of our early autologous transplants. And her daughter at the time was really very, very young. Her daughter, I'm not sure what her daughter's doing now, but it's amazing how she's able to watch her daughter grow up, successful transplant. I put this one up here, and this is a myeloma patient we did early on who she didn't do the New York Marathon, but as one of our haematologists says, this very stiff guy in the front row down here did the New York Marathon. I'm going to counsel him later on. But Anna McGregor, she did the City to Surf. But the other reason I put this one up, you notice on the left here, haematology was the first department at North Shore to have a clinical computer network. We had a great battle with the IT department that we wanted our own servers in the department. We didn't trust anyone. I won't go into all the ins and outs of it. But I was chairman of the clinical computing committee, so it made it a little bit easier. So we did all sorts of things in computing that, again, we apologised for afterwards, but they worked. You know, the lab people, remember we had wires running out the window to the lab computer, pin my window onto my computer. And Len Stanley, who was helping with computing, we actually started producing graphs. We were plotting our own graphs of things, and we had morphology on. So right back at this early stage, in the late 80s, we were trying to get into clinical computing. Now, it's all different now. There's great software available, but there wasn't that available then. Everything was very much being done manually. I put this up for Chris's benefit. As you know, Chris Arthur's been the world leader in managing chronic myeloid leukemia, which in the past we would be doing transplants for. You probably hardly ever do a transplant for it now, would you, Chris? And this just shows from a disease that when we had no treatment for it, or just busulfan, right up to where it is now, the changes that have occurred. And at one point in that, transplantation was part of therapy, but it now no longer is. And it's a disease. In fact, they're even now saying, you know, can we regard chronic myeloid leukemia as essentially a curable disease? Myeloma is another interesting one. I always used to say, when I got into haematology, I said, look, the one disease I don't want in haematology is myeloma. And one factor was, of course, we could treat it, but you know, the life expectancy wasn't that great. But it was the bone disease. It was the fractures. It was all those things. But this is a disease that we're not only able to treat the effects of the disease much better, but also dramatic improvement in recovery. So I think myeloma is another very good example of how dramatically things have changed. As many people now know, I live in Canberra because 3 of my 4 offspring are down there with most of my grandchildren. It's a great city to live in. It was great to escape from Sydney traffic, and I can ride my bike all around Canberra. But in 1998, I know there are a few smiling faces here because 1998 was the year that I fell off my bike in Lane Cove National Park when I was about to go to ASH, and I couldn't go to ASH, but I think Chris went to ASH, so I can't remember who else went to ASH that year, but it was just when we get on the internet, we used Gopher, there was no Google, Gopher, and all the abstracts were up. So I spent my whole time reading all the abstracts of ASH, I got all that, and when I got back I said, oh, that must have been a great meeting, you know, what do you think of, what do you talk about? I then worked out those guys didn't even go to most of the lectures. I knew more on the internet than what they'd got the lectures. Now, this is the bike that my 3rd son designed for me after my accident. He's a bit of a character, my 3rd son. But I can ride my bike around Canberra now. I can ride all over the place. Wonderful cycle tracks, and I can recommend Canberra for retirement. I mentioned Sir William Oser at the end. Sir William Oser, I regard as the father of personalised medicine. He's the one that pulled science, laboratory technology all together to then say this is the way we diagnose and make decisions about treatment. You can see this is the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. It was rather interesting. I only found out a few years ago that my grandfather in fact met Sir William Oser in London. But my father never actually mentioned it. But my father was always quoting William Oser's aphorisms. And so as people know, I have a lot of aphorisms I tend to use. Some are William Oser's, some are my father's, the other ones I make up myself. But when he gave his valedictory speech, now this is where I think Asa got it wrong. When he moved from Oxford, when he moved from Johns Hopkins to Oxford, he said that all doctors should be chloroformed at the age of 60. And people thought he was serious, and it got enormous coverage in the New York papers. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure being involved in all of this, and I must thank the team, all the teams involved. You know, on the slide I mentioned the nursing staff, the lab staff, transfusion staff. Everyone is absolutely committed to success, and you've got to make sure everyone understands what's going on. There's nothing worse than someone in the lab just being used or providing a product. They like to know what's happening up in the ward. And one thing we've always tried to do in haematology, because as Chris mentioned, you're dealing with a specialty where you can be looking at the bone marrow, the slides, the DNA in the lab.